think we'll just see where the discussion goes. So, but it is a sort of review of what's been happening recently and what might be happening just around the corner on these animals that are on our agenda. I'm conscious that there are other things like the cranes in Somerset, which is a fascinating project. So this isn't the sort of the full scope by any means. A quick experience Alison and I had a few years ago. We were invited to a certain office of Natural England because they were interested in doing something exciting at that time and wanted to start exploring lynx issues. And this was England, not Scotland. And they wanted our sort of informal advice, and it might grow, and they were then going to take it internally. And I thought, very interesting. My guess at the time was that as soon as this gets into the formalities of the structure of the organisation and the targets and the objectives and the corporate parameters by which our organisations have to work, it will get squashed. And that duly happened, of course. And that's the difficulty. I think a lot of people are very interested in this, even in their professional world. Their professional world doesn't allow them, perhaps, to sort of go beyond the straitjacket we've set ourselves in the way we do our work in this sector. And of course it's the same in many other sectors. One other quick issue, because a bit of experience, because I know that some people, and I accept the view, say, well, we ought to sort of look after our own endangered species and celebrate more the species we have here, even if they are not necessarily so charismatic. And I partly see that argument, but I think that the two issues are not mutually exclusive. And one bit of experience which really alerted me to the value of charismatic species was when a ringneck parakeet arrived in our garden a few years ago, and my kids were younger than they are now. And it was there for most days about 3 weeks. And I know if you were in the southeast of England that wouldn't be such an event, but it was in Gloucestershire at that time. And my kids every day were looking out for that bird and looking at its interaction with the others. But they were asking lots of questions about the other birds, and it really did open their eyes to the bird life in the garden. And it was so valuable. It was a passport to them to sort of, and my daughter particularly now sort of keeps a list, gets involved in garden bird watch. So that was the passport to her interest in birds. So I think the charismatics can do something for us on a wide level. So that's my bit of experience on this as an opening. I think we ought to move on to the beaver issue straight away. Delighted that Lisa, locally from Somerset Wildlife Trust, can help us with that, and Derek, locally as well, but round the corner in Devon, who's got various bits of experience on beaver, can join us as well. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves because they will do that properly. I only know a partial bit of their background on these things. So. And Lisa, you're going first.
I think Derek is.
Okay. All right, okay, fine.
Just to put you on the spot.
Well, my name's Derek Gowe. I guess I've been interested in rewilding issues for some time. I think the more I have to do with this initiative, the more I fall into your kind of camp. You become more and more sceptical, and you also begin to realise just how difficult culturally this actually is. We do live in a very densely used island, and we have to deal with the art of the possible and the deliverable. There are no two ways about that. And that's why I guess at the end of the day my interest in this really is condensed around beavers, because I think that is deliverable. I think there are some incredibly good reasons for delivering an animal like this over and above dealing with any other species which was formerly extinct here. And really, as far as I'm concerned, it was really put very well by Roy Dennis on a number of occasions that he spent his entire working life trying to conserve phalaropes and reintroduce eagles and kites and all these other charismatic bird species, and when it boiled down to it, they deliver very little as far as ecosystems are concerned. Whereas if you look at something like the beaver is basically, it's the generator of wetlands. Wetlands are the richest living environment there is on the planet. The biodiversity and the biomass that follows the activities of this animal is considerable, and therefore it's unarguably the most important animal that we should look at when it comes to restoration. That's a very simple thing to say, and it's a very difficult thing to do in a countryside where the state owns very little land and where you have to deal with very many other private landowners, people like large farmers, small farmers, private foresters, people who own a garden with a creek running at the bottom, and you have to develop some sort of consensus amongst them that what you're proposing is reasonable when they haven't the faintest idea of what you're talking about, because the level of ignorance there is with regard to this animal at the beginning of the 20th century is quite simply staggering. So I've involved, my involvement in beavers has led to supporting very many beavers at different times for different organisations from Germany and Poland and Norway into the UK. We quarantined all the animals for Knapdale and Kintyre, and for the last 3 years I've been the recipient of a grant from the Ecology Trust and the Esme Fairbairn Foundation to try and find trial sites for European beaver release into the wild, in inverted commas, in England, and it's been an education.
Okay, I'm Lisa Schneidau. I'm Director of Conservation at Somerset Wildlife Trust. So my day job is managing the conservation team and the operation of the trust across all our nature reserves and so on. But in my work, I've had a couple of interesting encounters with the whole rewilding beaver reintroduction issue. My first one was when I used to work for the Scottish Wildlife Trust. So we're going back to about 2002. And when the Scottish Wildlife Trust started to get involved in the whole beaver reintroduction issue, Scottish Natural Heritage had been working for a good 10 years trying to gather the evidence, the information and the political support for a trial reintroduction, and they still weren't getting anywhere. And I was involved in the bit where we were campaigning madly, we were getting debates in the Parliament, we even got into the Scottish Sun, which I can't think why. But anyway, the whole issue for me was a big learning curve in terms of campaigning, in terms of perception of environment, and in terms of the egos involved in various sectors to do with environment, because the things that were really genuinely holding back a trial reintroduction project in Scotland were a couple of people in the Scottish Executive who didn't want it to happen. And eventually the whole situation changed around, the politics in Scotland changed, the attitude towards a project like this slackened off a little bit, became less acute, and I think it's a bit of a moot point as to whether the trial reintroduction in Scotland actually happened, because the SNP wanted to do it before England, but that's maybe something we need to talk about a bit later on. It's rather interesting the way that the science can be there, the information can be there, the common sense can be there, the inspiration can be there even, and yet the human nature of politics and issues around that are the things that really determine what's happening. Now, in England, I've been involved, this issue seems to follow me around, but in Somerset, we've been looking at whether there may be a possibility of having beavers within a site on the Somerset level, which is possibly the most controlled water level management system in the entire country. Is this possible? Would this be possible within a fence? That's not a reintroduction. How might that work? Would it be valuable? Would it be valuable in terms of the benefits that Derek is quite rightly talking about? Would it be valuable in terms of engaging people? Would it be a nightmare? Would it be a really difficult PR issue with the landowners that we're working so carefully with to try to encourage them to do more for wildlife? Would it be a step too far? Would a sodding great fence around a big wetland be really, really offensive to a lot of people? Lots and lots of questions. And so we have been working with that, and Derek's been helping us with that. But again, in an England context, it is very, very interesting just how much pragmatism and how much of a management perspective rather than a wild perspective we may need to take in order to see these animals back in the environment in whatever way. So there's some quite interesting issues around that. But I've actually got with me a couple of beaver sticks. Now, in the office of Somerset Wildlife Trust, where all the reserve stuff goes on and everyone's busy doing their day job, somewhere in the corner there are 2 beaver sticks. This little bit of radicalism around. So I'll just pass these around. Loads of you have probably seen these, but should we talk a little bit about beaver ecology and what they actually do? Do you want to?
Okay, well, I mean, basically, if you can imagine a big water vole with a flat tail, that's essentially what beaver is. Well, you know from archaeological evidence it was once a very common animal in Britain. It was very widespread. Bryony Coles did an excellent review of the known information with regard to this, I think in 2008, and she's uncovered all sorts of different things. There was, of course, evidence in literature from people like Geraldus Cambrensis, who recorded seeing the beavers in the 1100s and in the River Tywy, and then of course you have mention of them in the work of Edward Harrison in the 1580s at the time of the first Elizabethan Vermin Acts, and they talk about it being an animal that is of such force. It's the shapes of a monstrous rat. Its jaws are of such force it can shear through a double billet in a night. And he says they prefer the stillest of rivers, But by the time that Harrison is talking about them in the 1580s, it's an animal which is very uncommon. It's gone from being an animal which was commercially extremely valuable to being an animal that's included in the Vermin Act because it was no longer harvestable. And the last record we have of a bounty being paid for a beaver head is actually from a place called Bolton Percy in 1780, which is just beneath York. Now, why were beavers commercially valuable? They were commercially valuable for a number of different reasons. Lisa's passed around the nice, clean, tidy sticks, so I'll just pass around these and give them a sniff. These are the castoreum glands of a beaver, because beavers feed principally on the bark of the willow tree. The castoreum, which when dried forms a dry compound, and when it's ground in a mortar and pestle, it kind of resembles demerara sugar. But because it's principally derived from because they principally feed on the bark of the willow tree, it has a very high concentration of a chemical called salicylic acid, and that's a basic ingredient of aspirin. So in the Middle Ages and early pre-modern times, if you took an infusion of castoreum in a drink or a potion, then it would relieve basic pain. And that was such a valuable part of what a beaver could provide that if you were a labourer in the early Middle Ages and you killed a beaver, then one gland was worth you 1 year's wage, another gland was worth another year's wage, and all the other body properties of the animal gave you a third year's wage. They were incredibly valuable animals. So if you go back in time to the Mesolithic, at a time when beavers were very common animals, where they dominated a landscape in the way they still do in some parts of North America and Russia. So you had whole river valleys that were basically soaked by the creature and maintained as wetlands in part by beaver activity. Then there would have been tens of millions of beaver, right the way through their western, eastern European range. That range at one point in time ran from Great Britain through into China and Japan, up to the Arctic Circle, down into Mediterranean Africa, and possibly into tropical Africa as well. By the time we'd finished killing these animals as a species, for their meat, for their fur, for their castoreum glands, at the beginning of the 20th century, we'd reduced the Western European population to 3 pockets, which collectively probably numbered no more than 400 animals. In Eastern Europe, we'd reduced the Eastern European population to about 2,000 animals, and that's all there was left living in the world. So it was an animal which we understood very well in medieval times, because it was so valuable from a commercial point of view. By the time we got to the beginning of the 20th century, we'd virtually forgotten all about it. And if you read some of the early naturalist accounts that were natural histories of Europe that were written in the 1920s or 1930s, they will tell you that beavers are a very rare animal. They only live in big, broad, riverine valleys. That these habitats are very rare, and therefore the animal will always be a very uncommon animal. And that is true until you get to the stage where you stop killing them. And when you stop killing them, we know that they can come out of these relic habitats and they can live once again right amongst us. So when we start to talk about wild land and rewilding, this is not a creature of wild land. This is a creature of cultural landscapes now, right the way through Europe. They live on the outskirts of Amsterdam, in drainage canals next to tomato farms, on the edge of Almere, which is a dormitory town for Amsterdam. They live in the English gardens in the middle of Munich. They live right the way through towns and cities and landscapes that we'd be perfectly familiar with, as far as this country is concerned. And the issue with beavers, I guess, really comes down to one of human tolerance. At the end of the day, we know they could live quite easily in England again. We know they could certainly live in Wales. We know that Scotland is a country where there's ample beaver habitat, and that the animals are very versatile, and that they will probably use materials and plants and develop living opportunities that that are quite out with the scope of the clever scientific studies that try to predict where they're going to be. But it is an issue of tolerance. It's an animal. It's an ability to change landscapes, to re-wet land in a significant way. And if we're going to live once again with this animal in this country, then we need to be incredibly pragmatic in our approach to them. And we need to realise that the vast majority will live in a landscape, rivers like the Tamar or the Otter, where they perform a largely beneficial role, retarding the growth of riparian tree scrub. or providing wetlands, which are very rich in all sorts of different kind of biodiversity and living opportunities for smaller species. But once they come out and they actually start to flood people's basements, or they flood a little girl's pony paddock and a family can't afford to have any more than half an acre, then we have to be prepared to kill them and make them into hats. It's pragmatic animal management, and this is really what we need to look at. And when we talk about sort of wildland and we start to debate these issues and we talk about some of the other species that we're going to consider later on, increasingly in the time I have spent in this, I have become utterly convinced that if we cannot deliver the return of the beaver, an animal that we know we can live with right the way through the rest of cultural Western Europe, if we cannot accomplish this, if we can't forge the alliances and make the compromises we need to make with the other land use organisations, and if we can't take people on board with us when it comes to this journey and do this in our lifetime, then we can do nothing else. Everything else is just chaff in the wind. It's talk and it's idle. If we can restore the beaver, then we can learn to live with this animal again. Then at the end of it all, it may be possible to consider what alternatives come next. But at the end of it all, if we can't restore this animal, then everything else really will be, I think, as far as I'm concerned, an utter impossibility.
Lisa, did you want to say anything else now, or shall I've got a couple of points I want to relate from my experience. Are you happy to open it to discussion, or did you want to say anything more from your...
Could I just say a little bit more about England?
Yeah.
And Derek can chip in on this far better than I can as well. It's been really interesting because there are a number of beavers within enclosures now in England. The Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, you might have seen on Spring Autumn Watch, there's beavers within enclosures there. The first, I think, were Kent Wildlife Trust. Yeah. And that must be well over 10 years ago now. Rather a wonderfully named reserve called Ham Fen near Sandwich, which always makes me laugh. But they put beavers within an enclosure. And when we were looking at this, as Somerset Wildlife Trust, we went over to see them, took a few of the trustees and a few of the staff along, with the aim of really infusing about what these animals could do. But Kent Wildlife Trust have had quite a few difficulties, some of which have been caused by the draconian requirements of DEFRA with respect to monitoring, fence checking and so on. Some of which are because the site is quite a dry site, and it's quite a small site as well. And you get the feeling that the animals are not thriving. And so when we are looking at these animals even within an enclosure, which is a very extreme form of control, it's not a reintroduction, but you could argue it as using the animals as a management tool, then I think we need to be very honest about all of our reasons why we may want to do that. Some of my staff are deeply suspicious. They say, well, there's an agenda. They just, you just want to do this, don't you, for doing it? And they get into lots of big assessments about whether the coppicing impacts of the beaver would be more cost-effective than the coppicing that could be done by volunteers. You start to get in real detail about this stuff. And you're just thinking, actually, yeah, we do want to do it for its own sake as well. We are interested in doing it because the site we're looking at, potentially doing this, is what you may politely call a late succession reedbed, which, a lot of it is going to start going back to woodland, and we are having the debate internally at the moment about how much of that, where's the balance? And how about that large bit of lowland raised mire over the way? And what about the water levels? And what's going to happen in 50 years? And all of those different things. And then you get onto the whole thing within the organisation about tourism benefits and about infusing people benefits. And then the membership departments start getting really interested, and you go on and on. I think as far as this animal is concerned, what it really does, yes, it is a great coppicing machine, but what it really does in terms of a managed landscape, even though it is a creature of a managed landscape, it chucks chaos into that landscape. It chucks diversity in a very temporary way in lots of bits of the landscape. So in coppicing, it's creating diversity in terms of the tree cover, in burrowing, in changing the water levels, in creating dams, in creating variety within that water body. It's doing that on a temporary basis. And really it's the conflict, and it is a conflict, between chucking chaos into an ecosystem and tightly managing the ecosystem for a particular product and the expectations that people have of that. That's really what the issue is, I think, with beavers. It is us as a culture, our reticence to allow space for a bit of chaos to happen. Even, and this is a crucial point, even within habitats managed for nature conservation, where we can be just as regimented in our approach and perhaps just as intolerant of chaos, letting go, as farmers maybe, or other sectors or other tribes maybe. And I just want to chuck that idea in, because from the point of view of the Wildlife Trust, that's quite an interesting place to be. And it raises questions in my mind, if we do this, what are we monitoring? Why are we monitoring it? And can we think a little more outside the box than perhaps we might have done 5 years ago?
Thank you. Splendid. I'm going to suggest that we have a quarter of an hour chat about some of these issues that you presented on the dilemma and the challenge of the beaver issue. I just want to relay a couple of experiences from Scotland, or one observation from Scotland, one experience. First of all, a few years back, I was due to help run a conference on reintroductions based in Scotland, but on the scope of reintroductions across the UK. And I was in Knoydart a few months before the event, and the conservation ranger in Knoydart was showing me around. And the next night, I was in the pub, and he brought the stalker. Knoydart is a community-owned location now. It's one of it's bought from the estate. So they do have a lot of control and influence over their own land and their own patch. It's a huge peninsula. And a lot of their trade there is people, stalkers, people viewing, experiencing the wild landscape, but also deer shooting. And the stalker came to me, heard about my interest in reintroductions or facilitating debates on reintroductions, and he said they would genuinely be interested in the wolf there because they thought it would reinforce their whole ethos of what they were doing, and it was a location which was manageable from a logistical point of view and a governance point of view. And I think that proves the point that actually, if people can see opportunities and benefits from their own perspective, they can embrace these things. They realise there are practical issues as well. But we shouldn't start off always with the point that we have to, that various people have to offer a proposition. It may be that there's actually people having an interest that could be awakened. I think the other interesting observation is the River Tay in Scotland, where the beavers did escape, and a lot of people, of course, saw them but didn't want to betray them, and they actually did experience that wildness of this creature out doing its own thing. So often it's the way the proposition comes, I think. If it's conservationist saying, you must have this, it's good for you, and in a hectoring way, I think that's people are going to be suspicious. It is how the deals are struck and people's awareness starts for these animals. So I'll just start with that viewpoint. I'll go to Dave because he's got his hand up, but I would, in this debate, be very interested in the archaeologist's view about how we live with beavers from your perspective and your observations in the past, and if there are any lessons from that now. But David, first of all.
I was just going to, it's really interesting actually. I was just going to give if you like, the skeptic's perspective. In intensively managed lowland Britain, farmers and landowners hate chaos. They like to be in control of everything. So chaos is a bit of a problem. But I've always found in the past, if I can find a way of working with the game lobby, and I have to put another confession in here that I am a fanatically keen trout fisherman, I have found it really interesting to see how bodies like the Wild Trout Trust and others have finally realised that our loss of insects, the whole way in which we have wrecked our watercourses, has had phenomenal impact on wild trout populations, and we get into stupid debates about restocking the test and all this sort of thing. And if you look at some of our beautiful rivers, we've got Hillnet and Balsam, we've got mink all over the place, we've got all sorts of issues. But there seems to be a growing groundswell that we've got a serious problem with our chalk streams and some of our beautiful rivers. And a bit like the Surfers Against Sewage, there are enlightened people who are actually saying, if we want to end up with sustainable populations of wild trout, we've got to rewild our rivers. We've got to seriously look at how we put back meanders, have gravel riffles, and people will spend a lot of money, and I do sometimes, to travel to wild places to have the experience of catching a wild fish in a wild location. And farmers and landowners listen to that argument. You will get farmers and landowners coming to events run by the Game Conservancy or the fishing guys, because there is an element of empathy there.
Yeah.
However hard you try, as soon as you come into the argument from the sort of more scientific, let's get all these chains back, it's an ecological debate, farmers tend to close their ears, and foresters to some extent as well, because I don't know why, it's maybe partly cultural at times, and historically we've been at loggerheads. But I just wonder if there's not a way in, listening to your comments about how in other countries they live side by side without causing problems. If you could go in if you look at the influence that in this part of the world, Rural Restoration Trust, the Southwest Waters work with a variety of people trying to encourage wild trout populations, they are having immediate direct impact with landowners and achieving quite a lot of stuff on a landscape scale. I'm just curious to know whether there's an automatic response from the fishing world that this is absolutely not what we want to see because it's going to bugger up all our rivers, or whether there's a recognition that actually this is all linked to getting more mayfly populations and actually getting natural rivers back again.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And I'm absolutely convinced that the way to develop this is through organisations like that. It's through the Association of Rivers Trusts, and it is through organisations like the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Salmon and Trout Association. We have been very slow to appreciate that from a nature conservation point of view. They have huge credibility with the wider landowning community. They're recognised and respected in a way that none of the mammal study faculties are in a conventional sense in the wider landscape. How do they respond to this? Because as a result of one project we're working on at the moment, I've spent the last 2.5 months arranging meetings with the Southwest Regional CLA, the NFU, the Salmon and Trout Association, the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, the Association of Rivers Trust, and the response has been, it certainly hasn't been Beaver's hallelujah, you can be sure of that, but it's been cautiously, it's not been unreasonable. They have concerns, there are caveats that they would want to see included in any project, but at the end of the day I think there is a growing realisation that there is something that should be considered here. And if Dylan Bright were here, he's always been very consistent in what he said, and he is no Beaver fan, but he will tell you that when you actually look at the science there is with regard to the species worldwide, that you have one end saying something white, the other end saying something black, and not a lot in the middle. And the only way you're ever going to come up with an answer with regard to the impact they have and how manageable they are in the British landscape is to put some out and see what happens next. And forget all the ruddy computer models and the thousands of pounds that are spent. That's a complete and utter waste of time. You've really got to put some beavers in, study them, see what happens next. And they are not opposed to that. And I think if you can work with them, the end benefits of this when it comes to liaison and establishing a working partnership with these organisations who are by and large reasonable and scientifically driven, will be incredibly positive. But it's the problem they all have, and maybe in nature conservation it's not quite as extreme, is that you have a staff and a proportion of the membership which is reasonable and logical. And then for some of these older organisations, especially the hunting, shooting, fishing and farming ones, you have a proportion of the membership which is from another time altogether. And making progress with these people is very difficult. And in reality, you are going to only make progress with them on the back of every funeral. And to give you an idea as to how that works out, a number of years ago, I was at the game fair in Scone. And by and large, we took some live beavers before the Knapdale licence was granted by SNH. Took some live beavers, and 98% of people that you met and talked to couldn't give a stuff about them one way or the other. Some thought, well, 1% thought it was a great idea, 1% thought it was an abomination sent by Satan. But I remember quite clearly one man who was the father of one of the guys I was working with, who was big estate owner in Scotland, and he came up and told me that, you know, he didn't want to hear anything from us nature conservation people. He was sick of us. And he was the best nature conservationist he knew, and he liked to see, you know, sparrowhawks in his estate, but if he saw more than one, he didn't want to see more than one because of eating his pheasants. And when he went to, you know, out to the estuary and he saw the seals, he liked seals, but didn't want to see more than a few of them because they'd eaten his salmon. And then it ultimately came down to when he goes to Birmingham and you see all the wogs and coons there, then there's too many of them as well. And that was what SNH in the first instance, that was the Labour government, the Labour executive in Scotland at the time, basically gave in to people like that. And it's a huge problem. But in fairness to those organisations, they realise this well, and it is changing. And you have two options. One is you ignore them and you marginalise them and you think you can do it yourself, which you can't, because you don't own the land. Even the state forest sector does not own sufficiently large blocks of land to make this possible without having to come to terms with other people. And this is the biggest challenge we have. It's not whether we can do it or it's desirable or the science is right or wrong. It's how we come to terms with people. And that's the central challenge that faces something like the beaver. You know, we know it's an incredibly important animal from a biodiversity point of view. What we should have mentioned just very briefly, it's an incredibly important animal when it comes to delivering things like sustainable water management, so the dams can strip out, you know, if you have a catchment, you know, with a lot of maize growing along the side, they can trap between 65 and 90% of the silts lost to erosion. You know, if you trap the silts, the phosphates, the chemicals that are put on the land are attached by electrolysis to the silts. So if you trap the silts, you trap the phosphates too. The phosphates are what are turning our estuaries green. It's a huge problem, and they never go. You know, when you chop down the trees, you have an open, sunny environment, and the plants that grow in that open, sunny environment in much greater profusion then absorb the nitrates which come from the land too. So there's a cracking economic argument for putting them in. All this stuff about ecotourism, it may apply in one place, but it is a Cinderella argument for the restoration of animals like this. It really is. But that argument, that water purification and management argument, is a huge commercial driver. And in time it will come. But to get there, we need to look at things that are very modest projects at the beginning, and we need to have partners like that. They're incredibly important.
I was just wondering, how would the reintroduction of the beaver affect like other species such as the otter, which is already fairly endangered? Is it going to be beneficial?
My understanding of it is that there is no direct competition there. In fact,
they live together for thousands of years. So.
Yes, they live together for thousands of years. But it's very interesting, just going on the back of what Derek has said, that, you know, I got a phone call in the office last week from a fisherman who's absolutely fed up with otters. He thinks the place is overrun with otters and they are going to eat all the fish. And there are still these basic misconceptions of basic ecology out there. And I think that there could be very, very happy coexistence. In fact, it could help, because if the beaver improves the health of the ecosystem by creating diversity, that would benefit otters on a lot of levels as well. You know, otters don't really have that many needs. They need really good food sources, and they need some lying up sites that aren't too disturbed. And, you know, they're travelling right the way through the middle of Taunton right now, probably. But I think one of the big differences is that beavers they live in small families. An otter can have a range of 50 kilometres quite happily. And so you've got quite different things going on there. And quite a lot of people get mixed up between beavers and otters, and they think that then beavers eat fish, and you get into that whole issue. The other real problem with the fishing sector, which Derek hasn't mentioned yet, is the notion of disease. And, you know, particularly bringing beavers in, any beaver that's released needs to go through quarantine, but there is still this real concern that it will bring disease from the continent that will wipe out everything and cause Armageddon, and then we're off again. And so I think that we can gain a lot of confidence from a lot of the work that has gone on in the rest of Europe, because reintroductions have happened in the vast majority of other European countries now. And there is this coexistence happening. There are a lot of different ideas on the role of beavers within, you know, for example, there's a wonderful chap called Duncan Halley from Norway, who will always turn up to a talk in a beaver fur waistcoat, because he advocates actually having healthy populations there so that they can be hunted. And that's all valid. That's all brilliant. Sorry, I'm going on, but I think they are a keystone species of that ecosystem that can help improve the health of it. They can help do that far more naturally and far more chaotically than perhaps we could. Perhaps we need to step up to the mark and look at things on a broader catchment basis, which we're still not doing.
In one of the river systems we looked at in France, the anglers were opposed to reintroduction of beaver. They didn't want it, but it happened anyway. And then one year there was a terrible drought, and lots of streams dried up and lots of fish stocks died, except the ones the beavers were operating. And then they actually saw, this is a good thing. You know, so it's.
I mean, the fisheries lobby are by no manner of means cohesively opposed to this. Janina Gray, who's the chief ecologist of the Salmon and Trout Association, came to Bavaria 2 or 3 years ago and produced a splendid paper, one of the best, I think, a review of literature with regard to beaver-salmonid interactions, which is very fair, very balanced, very sensible, and it concluded by saying that there really is no evidence that the beavers existing in a wider riparian landscape, you know, are as a species, you know, with their dam systems, are going to have an effect on migratory salmonids that is negative in an overall sense. So I think there's a willingness to explore it. And when you talk to, you know, I can't remember the name of the guy, he's the retired head of the Fascali Research Institute, Dr. John Thorpe, he will tell you that he thinks everything they do, from the storage of dead wood with an 80% greater biomass of aquatic invertebrates, you know, with the complexity of underwater environments, with all these tree heads falling there as refugia for fish and other aquatic. So it's all entirely positive. They have the potential, in his opinion, to completely reseed river systems with invertebrates. So I think the debate is very interesting, and it's not negative. But the problem with this is, guys, it's not a new idea. Jonathan Spencer has just gone, but Jonathan, where he would tell you that 26 years ago in Grisdale, the Forestry Commission nearly did this. They got to the point where they were, you know, at senior level, they were in support of this. They wanted to do this. They'd organised beavers from Scandinavia in the end. They'd organised roads and viewing stations. It was all going to happen. And they spoke to the NCC, and the NCC said no. And they said no for a reason that nobody can now define. And if they'd done it 26 years ago, we wouldn't be sitting here having this debate now. It's an idea which comes at times. It's here again now because there are beavers on Knapdale and Kintyre, and there is a large expanding population of beavers on the Tay, which have not officially been released. We think we've achieved something, but it's an idea that is perilously fragile. If we cannot do this now, at a time where there is largely support and sympathy within the statutory nature conservation authorities for it, where there's largely consensus, even amongst the groups that are not beaver advocates and would otherwise oppose it, if we cannot deliver a project which is modest and credible and sensible now, then I think the opportunity will pass, and we'll be sitting here 26 years again, you know, further down the line, those of us who are still alive, and we will have failed.
Alison, last point before Lisa, because I know Lisa's got to go.
It was only a small tactical point, and that is, should we be using the word chaos? It's just that when we say it, we relish it, because we think it's more life, and that's what we're after.
Diversity.
And we have a humour about it. Whereas, for everything you've just been saying, for others it's obviously, it's a scary
It's
chaos.
health of the ecosystem, which is
It's life.
It's-
We just want to add a little bit more life, and we're all keen on that, aren't we?
I think you're right. I think it's a good word, because we had some beavers escape from an enclosure on our farm, and I'll not talk about the story another time, but they got down onto the River Tamar. They spent 6 weeks on the edges of somebody else's farm in a grove of willow and alder that the guy had no use for. But Christ, when you looked at that in October, November, when it's short days, black skies, lots of rain, cold and wet, Jesus, it was chaos, described it perfectly. And for somebody who'd never seen that before, it was incredibly alarming. Scary. It scared them. It did scare them.
quickly, David and Peter. But
Yeah, before Lisa goes, we were talking earlier about this, that the Somerset Levels is a highly managed hydrological system with lots of levees and banks, and the idea that beaver might disturb that would apply to a lot of river systems that are where the floodplain is fundamentally protected by banking systems. What's the experience in Holland? Because they must have a lot of similar issues.
David, quickly now.
My follow-on point is just a thought, Lisa, that if we had the opportunity, instead of sticking a beaver on a nature reserve with a bloody great fence around it, I would be far more interested in doing a tributary project with a river restoration trust.
Yes. A trial
Getting some
project.
champion landowners,
Yes.
and let's do it properly, rather
Headwaters.
than just
Yes.
come to the nature reserve and see a beaver. I'm not sure in the end game is that going to take us much further forward.
Well, can I just add to that? Do Wildlife Trust not see that this is a charismatic species that could really be a flagship project for them, and they could have, there'd be many other spin-offs by having this new charismatic creature
I think,
around a
yes.
fence or in a pilot project?
I think a lot of trusts do, and obviously I can't speak for all 47 wildlife trusts, that would be a bit out of order, but I know Derek is having great difficulty at the moment. In fact, we both are trying to get responses out of wildlife trusts to say, what land are you interested in? And I don't think it's because people aren't interested in doing this. I think it's because people are absolutely up against it and probably doing two jobs apiece at the moment. And
Something else complicated.
it's a complex thing that's a wonderful thing. I wouldn't say it's considered a luxury at all. I think that's going too far the other way. But we are really struggling as a sector at the minute to actually get the resources and the staff resources to do the jobs we need to do, the basic stuff. And I think that it needs leadership from a higher level within different organisations to push a project like this forward, because one of the valid arguments that I think it's one of the only valid arguments with respect to should we try to do this now is this a funding priority with all the other things we're doing. Now you can argue that either way according to your bent and according to your bias and according to whatever you want. But if we are raising money for a project, and a reintroduction project is a modest cost compared to a lot of other conservation work, but it is quite a big cost, it's a lot of focus and effort, you want to do it properly. How does that compare to making sure that you are actually fulfilling your legal responsibilities on your nature reserves, or making sure that you're influencing as many landowners as you can out there? And we get to conflicting priorities because we all want to be doing more. That, I think, is the big challenge for organisations like mine. It's not an excuse by any means, but I think it just needs to be borne in mind with where we're at right now. Having said that, I'm not that good at this. Yeah.
Very much. Can we deal with the banks, the engineering of the banks in it later, if that's okay? I think we need to bring it to a close. I know you've got to go, so thank you very much for all your help over the last 3 days.
Have a good rest of the day.
Very much. We'll do a
It's
little.
been great.
We're going to do an article on this, Peter, between us or somebody here
Great.
at any cost, so we'll catch up.
It's been really good.
Derek is going to help us with the discussion on wild grazing and pet cattle later on, and we did ask him to bring a stuffed one of those, but
I couldn't quite get on the field.